The bowstring bit into Thomas Chandler's fingers as he drew it back. Arrow leveled at a shape crouched atop his fence rail, too broad-shouldered, too silent, too dangerous to be any fox or drunk fisherman he had chased off his land before. "Step down into the light," he called, voice steady despite the hammer of his own heart, "or I put this through you where you sit." The shape did not flinch. It rose instead, unfolding to a height that made Thomas's mouth go dry, and stepped off the rail with the liquid grace of something that had never once feared a drawn bow in its life. Moonlight found her then green-gray skin catching silver, tusks small and neat against a strong jaw, dark hair bound back in warrior's braids threaded with bone beads. She wore fitted leather armor, dark and supple, laced tight across a powerful body, a short curved blade at her hip and another strapped along her thigh. Her eyes, gold as a hawk's, fixed on him without a trace of alarm. "You would need to be faster than that, little huntsman," she said, her voice low and rough as river stone, "to put an arrow through Glasha Thunderroar." Thomas did not lower the bow, but something in him eased half a degree, some old instinct that told him this was no raider come to burn his roof. "You are on my land," he said, "in the middle of the night, armed. Give me a reason not to loose this." "I am scouting," she answered, and there was no shame in it, only a flat warrior's honesty that startled him more than a lie would have. "My chieftain sent me to look at your homestead, to find where it is weak. And have you found it?" Glasha's gaze swept the yard, the mended fence that had clearly been mended more than once, the sharpened stakes ringing the sheep pen, the way the cabin sat with its back to the cliff, so no one could come at it from behind, the neat lines of snares strung through the tree line that she herself had nearly walked into twice already that night. Her mouth curved, not quite a smile, more a grudging tilt of respect. "Not yet," she admitted. It was that admission, more than anything, that made Thomas finally lower his bow an inch. He had lived at the edge of the thornwood long enough, as the Lord's huntsman answering to no daily master but his own woodcraft, to know when a threat had already decided not to kill him. He studied her and turned the sheer size of her, easily a head taller than himself and twice as broad through the shoulder, the corded strength in her forearms, the confidence of a woman who had never needed anyone's permission to walk anywhere she pleased. She was, he thought with an honesty that surprised him even as the thought formed, breathtaking in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "You have got a strange way of scouting," he said, "standing in plain sight arguing with the man whose home you are meant to be weighing up." "You caught me," Glasha said simply. "I do not run from what I cannot outrun with dignity, and you nearly walked into my knife twice, so do not sound so proud of yourself, human." Thomas almost laughed. He caught himself before he did, because laughing at an armed orc scout on his own land at midnight seemed like a poor decision even for a man as steady as himself. But the urge was there, unfamiliar and warm in his chest. "Why does your chieftain want to know if my homestead is weak?" he asked instead. Something shifted behind her golden eyes, old grief, old duty, something heavier than the moment called for. "That," Glasha said, "is not a story for a man with an arrow still knocked to his string." He lowered the bow the rest of the way and set it against the fence post, deliberate and slow, so she could see every motion of it. "There," he said, "unknocked. Now it is a story for a man with empty hands." Glasha looked at him for a long moment, as if reweighing everything she had assumed about him in the space between one breath and the next, and something in her stance loosened just slightly, the readiness for violence banking down like a fire settling into coals. "You are either very brave," she said, "or very stupid." "My lord says the same thing," Thomas said, usually both in the same sentence. That finally drew something like a laugh from her short, surprised, quickly smothered, but real. And in that small, unguarded sound, Thomas Chandler felt the first thread of something he could not yet name pull tight between them, and he did not, even then, feel the urge to run from it. She did not leave that night, not right away. When she moved to go, favoring her left leg in a way she was clearly trying to hide, Thomas noticed the dark stain at her calf where one of his lower snare lines, meant for wolves, had caught her ankle in passing and torn the leather of her boot along with the skin beneath. She had walked on it without a word of complaint through half an hour of standoff, and he found that fact settling into him with more weight than it should have. "You are hurt," he said. "It is nothing. It is bleeding into my yard," he said, "which means it is my business now, whether you like it or not." Glasha's jaw tightened, pride warring plainly across her face, and for a moment Thomas thought she would simply vanish into the tree line rather than accept help from the man whose land she had come to judge. But the leg was bad enough that, when she shifted her weight, a flicker of real pain crossed her features before she could smother it, and that more than anything he said decided her. "Quickly," she said, "and only because a scout who cannot walk is no use to anyone." He brought her not into the cabin. Some instinct told him she would refuse that outright, and he did not blame her, but to the bench beside the smokehouse, where the firelight from the banked coals gave enough light to work by. He knelt at her feet and unlaced her boot with careful hands, aware the entire time of how close his head was to a set of hands that could snap his neck without effort, and aware, too, that she let him anyway. "Snare wire," he muttered, examining the cut. "Should have known better than to walk this ground at night. I set these lines myself. I know where every one of them sits." "I know where every stone sits in my mother's camp," Glasha said, "and I still stub my toe on the one by the fire pit every winter. Ground does not care how well you know it." He wrapped the wound with clean linen from the tin he kept for his own frequent cuts and scrapes, working with the same unhurried competence he brought to dressing a deer or splinting a hunting hound's leg. And if his fingers lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary against the warm gray-green skin of her ankle, neither of them remarked on it. "Why does your chieftain care about one huntsman's homestead?" he asked again, quieter now, "when there is a whole lord's keep 2 hours' ride from here with walls and soldiers worth scouting instead?" Glasha was silent long enough that he thought she would not answer. When she did, her voice had lost its edge of challenge, gone thoughtful instead, almost weary. "There is an old debt," she said, "older than you, older than your father likely, between my clan and yours, not your lord's line, yours, the Chandlers." Thomas's hand stilled on the linen wrap. "My family, that is what I was sent to learn," Glasha said. "Whether the debt still lives in you, or whether it died with whoever came before." He did not understand her, not fully, not yet, but something in the words struck a chord he could not place, some half-memory of his grandfather's stories about the sea, and an old carved knife kept wrapped in oilcloth in the cabin's rafters that no one in the family had ever been permitted to sell, no matter how lean the winters ran. "I do not know what debt you mean," he said honestly, "but if you are hurt on my land, I am not the kind of man who leaves a debt like that unpaid, whatever else is between our peoples." Glasha looked at him then with an expression he would spend many nights afterward trying to name, something between disbelief and the first stirrings of a feeling she clearly had no intention of admitting to a human she had known for less than an hour. "That," she said slowly, "is either the most foolish thing I have heard a human say, or the wisest." "Ask me again in a month," Thomas said, tying off the bandage, "and I will tell you which." She stayed 3 days after that, though she told herself and told him that it was only to properly finish her scouting, only to be thorough, only because a wounded leg made travel back to the war camp unwise before it healed enough to bear her weight over rough ground. She did not sleep in his cabin. Pride would not permit that, not yet, but took to the old drying shed at the edge of his land, and each day she watched him with the sharp, assessing eye of a warrior sent to find a target's failure point, and each day she found, instead, reasons to respect him further. She watched him rise before the gray light of dawn to walk the fence line, mending a gap a fallen branch had made in the night before any predator could find it. She watched him face down a lean, hungry wolf that came for his sheep at dusk, not with panic but with a steady, practiced calm, driving it off with nothing but a torch and a shout, and the sheer unwillingness to let it have what was his. She watched him ride into the fishing village of Saltmere Cove, half a mile below the bluff where his cabin sat overlooking the harbor, to help old Garrick haul nets that his rheumatic hands could no longer manage alone, taking no coin for it, waving off the old man's thanks with an embarrassed shrug. "You did not have to help him," Glasha said that evening, watching Thomas clean fish scale from his forearms at the well. "He would help me if our positions were reversed," Thomas said. "That is how a village survives out here. Everyone carries a little of everyone else's weight, or nobody makes it through winter." "My clan says the same of the war camp," Glasha admitted, and there was something almost wondering in her voice, as if she had not expected to find the sentiment mirrored in a place she had been taught to think of only as an enemy's ground. On the second evening, restless with the strange energy of being watched by a woman she was fairly certain could kill her without much effort, she challenged him to spar, not with real blades. She was not so reckless as that, but with staves cut from ash wood to see, she said, whether the huntsman's skill matched his reputation for holding his ground. He surprised her. He was not as strong as she was. No human could match an orc for raw power, and both of them knew it going in. But he was fast, and he had spent a lifetime reading the movement of animals and men both, anticipating a strike before it fully committed, sidestepping her heavier blows rather than meeting them head-on. She drove him back across the yard 3 times, and 3 times he circled and came at her from an angle she had not guarded, until finally, laughing despite herself, she knocked the stave from his hand and pinned him to the packed earth with her forearm at his throat, her face inches from his, both of them breathing hard. "Yield?" she asked, and her voice had gone rough in a way that had nothing to do with the fight. "Depends what I am yielding to," Thomas said, and the words came out lower than he meant them, an answer to something in her eyes rather than the question itself. For a long moment neither of them moved. The evening light caught gold in her eyes and turned the sweat at her collarbone to something like honey, and Thomas was aware, with sudden and total clarity, that he did not want her to get up. Glasha rose first, breaking the moment with visible effort, offering him a hand up he did not need but took anyway, her grip strong and warm around his own work-roughened fingers. "You fight well for a man your size," she said, too gruffly to hide what the words were covering. "You fight well for a woman who is supposed to be finding my weaknesses," he said, not admiring my form. "I admire nothing," Glasha said, and turned away too quickly for the denial to be convincing, leaving Thomas standing in the dusk with his pulse still thundering and a smile he could not quite suppress. It was on the 3rd night, with her leg healed enough to bear weight properly, that she came to find him at the cliff's edge above the cove, where he liked to sit after the day's work and watch the fishing boats bob home against the last light. She stood beside him without asking permission, close enough that her shoulder nearly brushed his, and for a while neither of them spoke. "I have to go back tomorrow," she said finally. "My chieftain will want my report." "And what will you tell her?" Glasha was quiet, watching the boats. "That your walls are sound, your traps are well laid and well tended, your instincts are sharper than any humans I have met. That you do not sleep unwary, and you do not fight unwisely, and there is no soft place in your defenses for a warband to press." "That is a long way of saying there is nothing worth attacking," Thomas said. "Yes," Glasha said, and turned to look at him fully, her expression unguarded in a way it had not been since the moment they met. "There is nothing here worth attacking, Thomas Chandler. Only something worth—" She stopped herself, jaw tightening, as if the next word had nearly escaped her without permission. "Worth what?" he asked, quiet, not pushing, only asking. She did not answer in words. She closed the distance between them instead. And Thomas, who had spent years alone in a cabin on a cliff answering to no one but the Lord's occasional summons and his own steady conscience, found himself with his hands cupping a face that could crush stone, kissing an orc woman under a darkening sky with a hunger that surprised them both. She kissed him back like something long denied, one strong hand fisting in the front of his shirt, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing as hard as they had after the spar. "That," Glasha said, voice unsteady, "was not part of my scouting report." Good, Thomas said. I would hate to think your chieftain sent you to kiss me for tactical reasons. Glasha laughed trio laughter this time, warm and full-end for one suspended moment on the cliff above Saltmere Cove. The old debt between their two peoples felt very far away indeed. But debts, old or new, do not stay buried simply because two hearts have found each other above a quiet harbor, and Glasha Thunderroar knew that better than most, which was why, come morning, she left before he woke, taking the healed ache of her leg and the far less healed ache of her chest back up into the hills toward her mother's war camp, to deliver a report that would not sit easily with the woman who had sent her. The war camp of the Thunderroar clan sprawled across a wind-scoured highland 3 days' hard walk from the coast, hide tents arranged in careful rings around great fire pits, banners of bone and dyed leather snapping in the mountain wind. Glasha walked its familiar paths with a strange unfamiliar weight in her chest, past warriors sharpening axes and skinning hides, past children practicing with blunted spears, until she came to the great tent at the camp's heart, where her mother waited. Chieftain Glasha Thunderroar sat upon a chair of lashed antler and hide, and even seated she filled the tent with the presence of a woman who had led her people through 3 wars and buried 2 husbands doing it. Age had silvered the black of her braided hair and carved deep lines beside eyes the same gold as her daughter's, but there was no weakness in the set of her jaw, only the particular exhaustion of a leader watching her people slowly starve as the old magic that had sustained their hunting grounds for generations continued, year on year, to fail. Beside her stood Krogan Ashclaw, a broad-shouldered war captain with a scar splitting one eyebrow and an old grudge against anything human that predated Glasha's own memory, arms crossed, expression already skeptical before Glasha had said a single word. "Report," Vashka said. Glasha stood straight, hands clasped behind her back in the formal posture of a scout addressing her chieftain, and made herself speak the words plainly, without the tremor she felt threatening beneath them. "The homestead of Thomas Chandler is well defended," she said. "Sound walls, well-tended traps, a man who does not sleep unwary and does not fight unwisely. There is no weakness worth attacking. I recommend against any strike on his land or the village below it." Silence followed, heavy as the mountain air before a storm. "No weakness," Krogan repeated, voice thick with contempt. "You were sent to find a way in, Glasha, not to fall in love with the target." "I am not," Glasha started, too quickly, and hated herself for the heat that rose in her face at the accusation landing so near the truth. 3 days, Krogan said. "You were gone 3 days scouting one man's cabin, when I could walk its perimeter in an hour. What were you doing the rest of the time?" "My duty," Glasha said, which was to be thorough, unlike some captains who have never once returned from a scout with information worth using. Vashka raised a hand before the exchange could sharpen further, and both of them fell silent at once, old habit deeper than anger. "The debt does not care whether the homestead has strong walls," Vashka said, and her voice, though quiet, carried the particular weariness of a woman who had spent too many nights lying awake with a dying land pressing on her chest. "The debt is choking us, Glasha. The herds thin every season. The rivers run low even in spring floods. 3 children died of a wasting sickness this past winter that our healers have no name for. The old pact your great-grandmother swore with the huntsman's line kept this land in balance for 4 generations, and it is unraveling now because no Chandler has stood beside a Thunderroar in blood since before either of us was born. I sent you to find whether that man was worth using, whether we could take what we needed by force if the bond could not be mended by choice. You tell me there is no weakness. Very well. Then tell me instead, is he worth binding to, or is his line already too weak to matter, so that I might simply claim the coast outright and be done with waiting?" The question landed like a stone in Glasha's stomach, because she understood with sudden and total clarity that her answer here would decide not simply the fate of one homestead, but the shape of a war. "He is not weak," she said slowly. "He is the strongest man I have ever seen who was not born an orc, but I do not know if that is what you are asking, Mother. It is exactly what I am asking, Vashka said. Is the old blood strong enough in him to renew what was broken? Or do we go to war for what should have been given freely generations ago? Krogan's mouth curved in something ugly and satisfied. Give me a war band in a month, he said, and I will settle the debt with fire, whatever the old pact says. It would be quicker. It would also kill us all, Vashka said sharply, if the drowned warden woke while we tried it. You know what the old stories say happens when blood spills into that harbor without the pact's blessing behind it. Glasha's mind raced back to the tales her grandmother had told around the fire, when she was small, of a guardian born from the sea itself, when her ancestor Glasha Thunderroar and a human huntsman named Elias Chandler had mixed their blood in the cove's waters to seal an oath of peace between their peoples. A guardian meant to protect both clan and village so long as the oath held true, but which turned wrathful and monstrous the moment the bond it guarded began to fray. Give me until the next full moon, Glasha said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. Let me learn whether the bond can be mended without bloodshed. If I fail, do as you will. Vashka studied her daughter for a long moment, gold eyes missing nothing, and Glasha wondered, not for the first time, how much her mother already suspected about the true nature of those 3 days at the coast. The full moon, Vashka said finally. No longer. And Glasha, if you have let your heart run ahead of your duty, know that duty will still be waiting for you when your heart is finished. Krogan said nothing further, but the look he gave Glasha as she left the tent promised she had not heard the last of his objections. Glasha returned to the coast within the week, this time openly, riding down from the hills in full daylight rather than slipping through the tree line by night, and the sight of an orc woman in warrior's leathers descending toward Saltmere Cove sent the village into a scramble of shuttered windows and grabbed pitchforks before Thomas came striding down from his cabin, unarmed, hands raised, shouting for calm before anyone did something they would regret. She is not here to raid, he called, positioning himself between the frightened villagers and Glasha's approach with a calm that came from somewhere deeper than mere courage. She is here on my account. Let her pass. It was old Murren, the village's keeper of harbor lore and unofficial healer, who lowered her raised lantern first, squinting at Glasha with an expression less of fear than of sudden, startled recognition. Thunderroar, the old woman murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. By the tides, I never thought I would live to see that name walk into this cove again. You know the name? Thomas asked, glancing between the two women. I know the old stories, Murren said. Come, both of you. If the Thunderroar blood has come walking back to Saltmere Cove after all these years, it is past time somebody told you both the truth of what your families owe each other. They gathered that evening in Murren's cottage near the harbor's edge, the old woman pulling a cracked leather journal from a chest that had clearly not been opened in years, its pages brittle and foxed with damp sea air. She read to them by lamplight the story of Elias Chandler, huntsman to the lord of that time, who had pulled a drowning orc chieftain named Glasha Thunderroar from a wrecked longboat during a storm that should have killed them both, and who had, in the gratitude and strange kinship of two people who had each expected to die that night and hadn't, sworn an oath with her in the cove's shallows blood mixed with seawater, sealing a pact of peace and shared harvest between their two peoples. Sworn to be honored so long as Chandler blood and Thunderroar blood remembered each other with honor. The pact kept the harbor generous and the hunting grounds fair for 4 generations, Murren said, closing the journal gently. But pacts like that are living things, child. They need tending. Somewhere along the way, your grandfather's generation forgot to tend it too. Many years of quiet peace made men lazy about remembering why the peace existed at all, and slowly, the old magic that fed both our harbor and their hunting grounds has been fraying loose at the seams. The bad catches these 5 years past. The storms that come from nowhere. I would wager good coin their herds have thinned just the same. They have, Glasha said quietly, thinking of her mother's tired eyes, of the wasting sickness that had taken 3 children over the winter. Badly. Then the old debt is not merely a memory, Murren said. It is a debt still owed, and it has been quietly starving both our peoples while nobody remembered to pay it. Thomas sat very still, turning the shape of his own family history over in his mind. The carved bone knife wrapped in oilcloth that his grandfather had kept, unexplained in the rafters, that his father had refused to sell even in the leanest winter, that had passed to him 3 years ago when his father died with instructions only to keep it safe and never ask why. "I have it," he said suddenly. "The knife, my family's knife. It has been in our rafters for as long as anyone remembers." Murren's eyes lit with something between hope and vindication. "The oath blade," she breathed. "Bring it, boy. If the old stories are true, that blade is the last piece we need to mend this properly if it comes to mending rather than war." That night, in the small, warm hours after Murren's revelations had settled into something Thomas and Glasha both had to sit with in silence, they walked together along the cliff path above the cove, the sea below them silvered by a moon 3/4 full. "2 weeks," Glasha said. "That is what your moon gives us before it is full and my mother's patience runs out with it. 2 weeks to mend 4 generations of forgetting," Thomas said. "That is not much time." "No," Glasha agreed, "but it is not nothing either." She stopped walking, turning to face him fully, moonlight silvering the strong planes of her face. And Thomas felt again that pull toward her that had only grown stronger every day since the night she had crouched on his fence rail like a thing out of nightmare, and turned out, instead, to be the most extraordinary woman he had ever known. "Whatever happens with the pact," he said, "with your mother, with Krogan, with all of it, I want you to know I am not afraid of what you are, Glasha. I was never afraid of what you are." "I know," she said, and there was wonder in it still, even now, as if she could not quite believe her own good fortune in having found a man who looked at her and saw not a monster to be feared or a weapon to be used, but simply her. "It is the strangest thing about you, Thomas Chandler. You look at me and you do not see a threat. You never have, not even that first night." "I saw a woman doing her duty," Thomas said, "same as I do mine. And then I saw a woman who deserved better than to be sent alone into the dark to judge whether my life was worth ending." Glasha reached out and traced the line of his jaw with a thumb thick and strong enough to crush the bone beneath it, gentle as a whisper. "My mother is not cruel," she said. "She is desperate. Desperation makes even good leaders reach for harder choices than they would otherwise. If I cannot show her the pact can be mended without bloodshed, she will send Krogan and every spear he can gather, and no wall you have built will hold against that, however well tended your traps are. Then we mend it," Thomas said simply. "Whatever that takes." She kissed him then, unhurried this time, no urgency of a stolen moment on a cliff before duty called her away, but something slower and deeper, a promise settling into shape between them that neither of them spoke aloud but both understood completely. When they finally parted, Glasha rested her forehead against his, her breath warm against his skin. "I did not expect this," she admitted. "I was sent to find weakness. I did not expect to find the one thing in this whole broken pact that might actually be strong enough to mend it." "What is that?" Thomas asked. "Us," Glasha said simply, and the words settled between them like a vow neither of them had yet had the chance to speak formally, but both of them already meant. The 2 weeks that followed were not quiet ones. Word spread through Saltmere Cove that the huntsman on the bluff had taken up with an orc woman, and though Thomas's standing in the village built over years of honest help and quiet reliability kept outright hostility mostly at bay, there were sideways looks at the market stalls, mutters from men who remembered old wars with the orcs even if they had never fought in one themselves, and one ugly confrontation at the harbor when a drunk fisherman named Perrin Voss, 3 cups deep into cheap ale, called Glasha a beast to her face in front of half the docks. Glasha did not draw a blade. She did not need to. She simply stepped forward, close enough that Perrin had to crane his neck to meet her eyes, and said, with a calm far more frightening than any shout, "I have killed men larger than you for less than what you just said." I have not, because Thomas Chandler asked me to be patient with your people's fear, and because I respect him too much to make him regret it. Do not test how far that respect stretches." Perrin's friends dragged him away before he could answer, and the story of it spread through the village faster than the confrontation itself had lasted. And something in the way it spread, not with fear of her cruelty, but with a grudging, startled respect for her restraint, began slowly to shift the temperature of how Saltmere Cove looked at the orc woman living openly on their huntsman's bluff. Thomas, for his part, spent those 2 weeks learning everything old Murren's journal, and the village's oldest memories could tell him about the pact, about the drowned warden that legend said slept beneath the harbor's deepest waters, about the proper rites of blood and blade his ancestor Elias had performed to first call the guardian into being. He oiled and sharpened the oath-blade knife of dark, ancient bone carved with runes worn nearly smooth by generations of careful handling, and kept it close, some instinct telling him he would need it sooner rather than later. He was right. 10 days into the fortnight, with the moon swelling fat and near full over the water, the sea began to change. It started subtly, fishermen returning with nets full of fish gone strange and gray-eyed, dead before they ever hit deck despite the freshness of the catch. Then the tides began running wrong, pulling out further than any elder could remember and rushing back in swells that had no business appearing on a calm evening. Old Murren's face, when she came to find Thomas and Glasha at the clifftop cabin, was grave in a way neither of them had yet seen from her. "The warden is waking," she said. "I feared it might, with the pack stretched so thin and the full moon so close. It has been sleeping uneasy for years, but a true waking that has not happened in 4 generations, not since the pact was first sworn." "What happens when it wakes fully?" Glasha asked. "The old stories are not gentle about it," Murren said. "It rises to judge the debt. If the pact holds true in the blood of those meant to carry it, it recognizes the bond and returns to its rest, blessing the water as it goes. If the pact has failed, if there is no one left who remembers, no blood strong enough to answer it." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. That same evening, as the sky over Saltmere Cove began to bruise with storm clouds that had gathered from nowhere in the space of an hour, a horn sounded from the ridge above the village, not the village's own signal, but a deep, resonant call that every soul in Saltmere Cove recognized instantly from old nightmares and older stories. War horns. Orc war horns. Thomas and Glasha both ran to the cliff path in time to see them. A war band of some 40 warriors descending from the Highland Trail toward the coast road, banners of Thunderroar bone and hide snapping in the rising wind, and at their head, unmistakable even at this distance, the broad and furious figure of Krogan Ashclaw. "He did not wait for the full moon," Glasha said, horror creeping into her voice. "My mother said we had until the full moon." "Maybe your mother did not send them," Thomas said grimly. They found out within the hour, when the warband reached the village outskirts and villagers came pouring up the cliff path in a panic, and Thomas and Glasha went down to meet them at the boundary stones marking the edge of Saltmere Cove's fields, where Krogan had halted his warriors in a loose battle line, axes and spears, catching the strange green-gray light of the gathering storm. But it was not Krogan who dismounted first from the small cluster of riders at the warband's rear. It was Chieftain Glasha Thunderroar herself, older and grayer than Glasha had seen her look even a fortnight before, moving with the careful stiffness of a woman whose body was failing faster than her will, flanked by 2 of her most trusted shield-bearers. "Mother," Glasha breathed, stunned. "You said the full moon." "Krogan did not wait for my word," Vashka said, and her voice, though weak, carried across the field with the particular fury of a leader betrayed by her own captain. "He gathered warriors behind my back and marched while I slept, claiming the debt gives him the right to act if the chieftain delays too long in weakness. I came the moment I woke to find them gone, to stop this before it becomes a war neither side can walk back from." "It is already too late for that old woman," Krogan called from horseback, loud enough for the assembled villagers to hear, loud enough that Thomas saw hands tighten on pitchforks and old hunting bows all along the field's edge. "The pact is broken. The warden wakes to judge it. Let it judge an empty harbor rather than a living debt unpaid. We take the coast now, while the humans are too frightened to fight properly, and settle 4 generations of hunger in a single night." "You would slaughter a village to settle a debt that was never theirs to pay," Glasha said, stepping forward, putting herself, Thomas realized, with a jolt directly between Krogan's warband and the villagers behind her. "The debt is between the Thunderroar line and the Chandler line, Krogan, not between our clan and every fisherman who has never wronged us. The debt is between our peoples," Krogan snarled, "and I am done waiting for a scout who fell in love with her own assignment to decide how it gets paid." It was in that moment, with storm light flickering violet along the ridge and 40 warriors bristling on the edge of violence, that Glasha Thunderroar did the thing that would change everything that followed. She raised her voice, weak but unmistakably a chieftain's voice, and spoke words that made every warrior on that field, Krogan included, drop instantly and instinctively to one knee. "Warriors of the Thunderroar clan," she said, "hear your chieftain, and hear the truth I should have spoken plainly a fortnight ago rather than hiding it behind a scouting order. My daughter Glasha is not merely a scout I sent to weigh one man's worth. She is my heir, blood of Ugra Thunderroar, who first swore this pact, the last of our line who carries the old blood strong enough to answer the warden's judgment should it wake fully. I sent her to that homestead because if the debt is to be paid without a war that would bleed both our peoples dry, it must be paid through her blood and his, not through Krogan's axes." The field went utterly silent, save for the rising wind and the distant, wrong rhythm of waves crashing harder than they should against the harbor rocks below. Thomas stared at Glasha, the pieces of the past 2 weeks rearranging themselves in his mind with dizzying speed, the confidence with which she had walked into his homestead unafraid of anything, the way even Krogan, for all his contempt, had never quite dared to challenge her outright, the weight her mother had placed on this single fortnight's outcome. She was not merely a scout who had stumbled into love against her orders. She was the heir to an entire clan, and the debt her mother spoke of ran not through some abstract notion of 2 peoples, but through her own blood directly, inherited from a chieftain 4 generations dead who had first bled into these waters beside Thomas's own ancestor. "You are the heir," he said, quiet, stunned. "You never told me." "I did not know how," Glasha said, and for the first time since he had met her, he heard real fear in her voice, not fear of Krogan, not fear of the storm, but fear of how he would look at her now that he knew. "I did not want you to see me only as a chieftain's daughter sent to weigh your worth like cattle at auction. I wanted you to know me first as Glasha." Just Glasha. Thomas closed the distance between them and took her face in both hands, storm wind whipping around them both, 40 kneeling warriors and a village full of frightened fishermen watching, and none of it mattered in that moment beside the simple, overwhelming fact of her. "You are still just Glasha to me," he said. "Heir or scout or chieftain's daughter, none of it changes what I already know about you. It just means the stakes were always bigger than either of us understood." Krogan, still kneeling but with fury darkening his scarred face, spat into the dirt. "Sentiment," he snarled, "will not feed our children through another dying winter." "No," Glasha agreed, straightening with visible effort, "but neither will your impatience, Krogan. The warden wakes regardless of what any of us decide standing here arguing. Look." She pointed, and every eye on that field turned toward the harbor below, where the water had begun to churn and rise in a way no natural tide could explain, dark shapes writhing beneath a surface gone black as pitch despite the last gray light of dusk. And somewhere beneath the growing storm's howl, a sound rose that no one present would ever fully forget. A deep, resonant groan, like the hull of some vast drowned ship finding its voice after generations of silence. The drowned warden was waking, and it was waking angry, and it did not care in the least whether the humans and orcs gathered on the cliffs above had settled their argument yet. The transformation of the harbor happened faster than anyone could organize a response to it. Boats still moored at the docks began to pitch and groan against their ropes as the water beneath them churned violently. And then, with a sound like the world tearing, a shape broke the surface that made every warrior on that field, orc and human alike, take an involuntary step backward. It rose serpentine and vast, a body of storm-dark water given terrible cohesion, scaled with what looked like drowned wreckage-old ship timbers, tangled anchor chains, the bleached ribs of some ancient leviathan long since claimed by the sea, its head crowned with something like antlers made of coral and bone, eyes burning a sickly phosphorescent green in sockets deep as wells. It towered easily 3 times the height of the tallest mast in the harbor, and when it opened a mouth lined with teeth like broken glass and roared, the sound rattled loose stones from the cliff face and sent half the village's fishing boats capsizing at their moorings. "That," old Murren shouted over the chaos, arriving breathless at the cliff edge with her lantern swinging wildly, "is the warden come to judge us all, and it will not wait politely for anyone's speech to finish." Villagers screamed and scattered from the harbor's edge. Orc warriors broke formation in genuine alarm despite Krogan's shouted attempts to hold the line, and boats still crewed by fishermen too slow or too frightened to abandon them pitched wildly as the warden's massive coils churned the water into a maelstrom. "The oath blade," Thomas said suddenly, already moving. Murren said the blade and the blood together were the only things that could answer its judgment. "I have it at the cabin." "There is no time to climb the bluff and back." Glasha shouted after him, but he was already running, and after a heartbeat's hesitation, she ran with him, matching his pace easily despite his head start, both of them scrambling up the cliff path while behind them the warden's roar shook gulls screaming from the rocks. They reached the cabin in minutes that felt like hours, Thomas tearing the oilcloth-wrapped bundle from the rafters with hands shaking more from urgency than fear, unwrapping the ancient bone knife his family had guarded unknowingly for 4 generations. The runes along its blade seemed to catch the strange stormlight and hold it, glowing faintly, as if recognizing at last the purpose it had been carved for. "We do not have much time," Glasha said, watching through the cabin window as the warden's massive coils began sweeping toward the harbor's fishing boats, toward old Murren's cottage, toward the very docks where villagers she had come to know were still struggling to drag capsized neighbors from the churning water. "Then we do not waste any of it," Thomas said, and they ran back down the cliff path together, the oathblade gripped tight in his hand, storm rain beginning to lash sideways off the sea as thunder cracked overhead. They reached the harbor's edge just as the warden's tail swept a fishing boat clean off the water, sending 2 men flying into the churning dark. Without a word passing between them, Thomas and Glasha both dove into the shallows where the men had fallen, hauling one gasping fisherman up by his collar while Glasha waded chest-deep into the black water to seize the other, hauling him bodily onto the dock with an ease that made the man weep with relief once he realized what had just saved him. But the warden was not finished. Its vast head swung around, phosphorescent eyes fixing on the 2 figures standing together at the water's edge, the huntsman with the ancient bone knife glowing faint runes in his hand, and the orc woman whose blood carried the last living echo of the chieftain who had first bound this creature to its long watch, and something in its terrible ancient awareness seemed to recognize them both at once. It surged toward them. Now. Old Murren screamed from somewhere behind, half carried away by 2 villagers even as she shouted her instructions across the chaos. "Blood in the water, both of you together, the way it was done the first time, or it will not know you for what you are." There was no time for ceremony, no time for careful ritual words. Thomas drew the oathblade across his own palm in one sharp motion, hissing at the sting, and thrust his bleeding hand toward Glasha even as the warden's shadow fell across them both, its massive jaws opening wide enough to swallow a fishing boat whole. Glasha did not hesitate. She seized his wrist with one hand and drew her own blade across her palm with the other, pressing their bleeding hands together and then, in the same motion, thrusting both their joined hands down into the churning black water at the harbor's edge, exactly as her ancestor and his had done 4 generations before in this same cove. Glasha Thunderroar and Elias Chandler swore peace in this water, Glasha shouted into the storm, voice raw and fierce, and their blood remembers even when men forget. I am Glasha Thunderroar, heir of that oath, and this is Thomas Chandler, blood of the man who swore it beside her. We do not come to break the pact, we come to renew it. For one terrible, suspended moment, nothing happened, and the warden's jaws continued their descent, close enough now that Thomas could feel the cold, ancient stench of drowned centuries rolling off its open maw. Then the water where their blood mixed began to glow faint at first, then blazing bright as captured moonlight, spreading outward across the harbor's churning surface in expanding rings of pale gold light. The warden froze mid-strike, its terrible green eyes flickering, its vast coils shuddering as the light washed over them, and the roar that had shaken stones from the cliffs shifted slowly into something almost like a low, mournful groan recognition, rather than fury. It reared back, towering once more against the storm-torn sky, and then, with agonizing slowness, began to sink, its massive form dissolving not into violence, but into the very water it had risen from, scattering into foam and pale golden light that spread across the whole harbor in a wave of calm that seemed to physically push the storm clouds back from the coast. Thunder that had cracked continuously for the past quarter-hour rolled once more, distant now, retreating, and the wind that had howled sideways off the sea gentled to a mere strong breeze. Silence fell across Saltmere Cove, the stunned, disbelieving silence of villagers and warriors alike staring at a harbor gone suddenly calm, its waters glowing faintly gold in the last moments before the light faded entirely and left only ordinary moonlight breaking through parting clouds. Thomas and Glasha stood together at the water's edge, hands still joined and bleeding, both of them breathing hard, both of them staring at each other with the particular disbelief of people who had just together faced something ancient and terrible, and somehow walked away not merely alive but victorious. "We did it," Thomas said, voice hoarse with disbelief and rain. "We did," Glasha said, and then, with a fierceness that startled him even after everything they had just survived, she pulled him against her, one hand cradling the back of his head, and pressed her mouth to the side of his throat. Not a kiss, not quite, but something older, something with weight and intention behind it, teeth grazing skin in a bite sharp enough to sting but controlled enough that Thomas understood instantly it was no accident and no attack. He gasped, more from surprise than pain, and felt something pass between them in that moment beyond the physical warmth spreading from where her mouth marked his skin, settling into his blood like the last piece of some puzzle clicking finally into place. "What was that?" he breathed, one hand coming up to touch the mark forming at his throat, already darkening to something between a bruise and a brand. "Acclaiming," Glasha said, and for the first time since he had known her, her voice trembled with something that was not fear but pure, unguarded feeling. "My people mark what we will not let go of, Thomas Chandler. In the moment we know beyond doubt that we cannot live without it. I have known that about you for longer than I have admitted, even to myself. Tonight, fighting beside you, watching you stand unafraid against something that terrified 40 armed warriors, I could not wait any longer to make it known." Thomas felt something in his chest crack open entirely, all the careful loneliness of years spent as a huntsman answering to no one, needed by no one beyond a lord's occasional summons, dissolving in the face of being chosen, utterly and without reservation, by a woman who could have had anyone and had decided, against every expectation either of them had started with, that she wanted him. "Then mark me again," he said, because I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." Around them, on the cliffs and the docks, villagers and warriors alike were slowly emerging from the stunned aftermath of what they had witnessed, staring at the calm harbor, at the two figures standing together at its edge, at the fading golden light still shimmering faintly across the water like the last embers of a fire banked for the night. It was Chieftain Glasha Thunderroar who moved first, making her way down the cliff path with the careful, deliberate steps of a woman whose body was tired, but whose will remained entirely intact, until she stood before her daughter and the huntsman both, studying the mark on Thomas's throat with an expression that shifted slowly, from cautious assessment to something like relieved wonder. "The pact is renewed," she said, more to herself than to anyone else, and then louder to the assembled crowd of warriors and villagers both. "The pact is renewed. The debt our peoples have carried unpaid for 4 generations is settled this night, in blood freely given and love freely chosen, exactly as the old oath demanded it must be." A ragged cheer rose from some of the villagers, cautious but real, and several of the orc warriors lowered their weapons entirely, murmuring among themselves at the sight of the calmed harbor and the fading light. But Krogan Ashclaw, still furious, still unwilling to accept an outcome that stripped him of the war he had marched 40 warriors to claim, pushed forward through the crowd, axe still gripped tight in one scarred hand. "This proves nothing," he snarled. "A trick of old magic and a human's charm does not undo generations of humans hoarding what should have been shared fairly. I do not accept a chieftain's daughter throwing away her people's rightful claim for the sake of a bedmate." "Then challenge it properly, Krogan," Glasha said, stepping forward, her voice carrying clear and hard across the suddenly tense gathering, "if you doubt the pact's renewal or my right to have sealed it. Challenge me here, before both our peoples, and let the outcome settle what words apparently cannot." Krogan's eyes narrowed, calculating, and Thomas felt his stomach drop at the realization of what she was offering. A duel, real and dangerous, fought in front of the entire village and the entire warband both, with the future of the peace itself hanging on its outcome. "Not you," Krogan said slowly, a cruel smile spreading across his scarred face as his gaze shifted deliberately to Thomas. "If the pact is truly sealed through a human's blood as well as yours, let the human prove it worth the claim. I will fight the huntsman. If he falls, the pact dies with him, proven too weak to hold, and we take the coast as was always our right." "That is not how the old law works, and you know it," Glasha said sharply, but Krogan only shrugged, unmoved. "Then let your daughter's chosen mate prove the old law wrong," he said, "or admit the pact was never strong enough to stand against a real test." Thomas felt Glasha's hand tighten around his, felt the fear in her grip even as her face remained carefully composed for the watching crowd, and understood with total clarity that this was a moment he could not step back from without losing everything they had just fought to protect. "I accept," he said, before Glasha could argue him out of it, before his own fear could catch up with his mouth. "But not with axes, Krogan. You outweigh me by half again my own size, and you know it. If this is meant to prove whether the human line still carries strength worth respecting, let it be a fair test, not a slaughter dressed up as ceremony. Staves. First to yield or first blood, not first death. That is a test of worth. What you are asking for is simply murder with witnesses." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd at that, and Thomas saw, to his surprise, several of the older orc warriors nodding slowly, some old sense of fairness in their own traditions responding to the challenge's reasonableness even as Krogan's face darkened further. "Fine," Krogan spat. "Staves, first blood. And when I draw yours, human, do not expect any further mercy from my warband." They cleared a space at the harbor's edge by torchlight, villagers and warriors ringing the makeshift arena in a tense, silent crowd, and Thomas felt the strange vertigo of standing, once again, at the center of a moment that would decide far more than his own life. Glasha pressed the ashwood stave they had sparred with weeks before into his hands, her golden eyes fierce and afraid all at once. "You do not have to prove anything to him," she said quietly. "I already know your worth." "I know," Thomas said. "But your people do not yet. And if this is what it takes for them to stop looking at me and seeing only a weak point to be tested, then I would rather stand here and prove it than spend the rest of our lives with Krogan whispering doubt into every ear that will listen." She kissed him once, hard and quick, in front of the entire assembled crowd, orc and human both, a public claiming that drew gasps from villagers unused to such open affection between their kind and hers, and then stepped back to let him face Krogan alone. The duel that followed was fast and brutal in its intensity, though bloodless in its early exchanges. Krogan's strikes came like falling trees, each one carrying enough force to end the fight instantly if it landed true. And Thomas found himself relying entirely on the reflexes honed across years of tracking wolves, and reading the subtle tells of creatures far more dangerous than most men assumed a simple huntsman ever faced. He ducked, sidestepped, let Krogan's own momentum carry him past twice, and twice nearly found an opening to press his advantage before Krogan's superior strength forced him back on the defensive again. The crowd's silence broke into scattered gasps and shouts as the fight wore on, torchlight flickering across two combatants locked in a contest that had stopped, somewhere in its third minute, being merely about proving a point and become instead a genuine test of survival. Thomas felt his arms burning with the effort of parrying blows that would have shattered bone if they landed unguarded, felt sweat and rain mixing on his brow, felt the particular clarity that came from knowing exactly how much was riding on his next several decisions. It was Krogan's own fury, in the end, that undid him. A wild overhead strike thrown with more rage than precision, meant to end the fight in a single decisive blow, that Thomas read a half-second before it landed and used against him, sidestepping at the last instant and bringing his own stave up hard across Krogan's exposed forearm as the larger warrior's swing carried him past. The crack of ash wood against bone rang out across the suddenly silent harbor, and Krogan's stave went spinning from his grip, a thin line of blood welling along the scrape where Thomas's follow-through had caught skin. First blood. The fight was over. Krogan stood frozen for a long moment, staring at his own bleeding arm with an expression of pure disbelief, before slowly, and with visible effort, lowering himself to one knee before the assembled crowd. "The huntsman's line proves worthy," he said, the words clearly costing him something to speak. "By the old law, and I withdraw my challenge to the pack's renewal." Glasha Thunderroar stepped forward into the torchlit ring, and though her voice was tired, it carried across the entire harbor with unmistakable authority. "Let it be known," she said, "that this night the ancient pact between the Thunderroar clan and the line of Elias Chandler has been renewed in blood, sealed in claiming and proven worthy in fair contest before both our peoples as witnesses. There will be no war between us. There will be, as there was meant to be 4 generations past, a shared peace, a shared harbor, and a shared future." The cheer that rose then was neither cautious nor scattered. It rolled across the cliffs and the docks in a genuine wave of relief and celebration. Villagers and orc warriors alike, many of them strangers to each other only hours before, embracing the sheer disbelieving joy of a night that had begun in terror and ended, against every expectation, in peace. Thomas found himself pulled into Glasha's arms amid the celebration, her strength nearly lifting him off his feet as she held him, laughing and crying at once in a way he suspected she had not allowed herself to do in front of others for a very long time. "You could have died," she said into his shoulder. "You could have let Krogan kill you rather than risk everything on a fair fight." "I trusted my own skill," Thomas said, "and I trusted that you would not have chosen me if I was not worth choosing." "I would have killed Krogan myself if he had drawn more than a scratch from you," Glasha admitted, pulling back to look at him with fierce, damp eyes. "Pact or no pact, I want that understood between us clearly, Thomas Chandler. Whatever peace we have built tonight, you are mine, and I do not share what is mine, not even with an old law demanding fairness." "I would not want to be anything else," Thomas said, and kissed her again, slow and certain this time, with no urgency of danger driving it, only the simple, overwhelming relief of two people who had found, against every improbable circumstance, exactly what they had not known they were looking for. The weeks that followed the duel brought changes to Saltmere Cove that no one, human or orc, could have predicted a month earlier. The harbor's catches returned to their old abundance almost immediately, nets coming up heavy with fish in numbers the oldest fishermen swore they had not seen since their own grandfather's time. Word spread up into the Highland war camp that the herds there, too, had begun to thicken again within days of the pack's renewal, the wasting sickness that had claimed children over the winter simply ceasing, as if some long-held breath across the land had finally been released. Chieftain Vashka, freed from the crushing weight of a dying land's slow starvation, found her own strength returning with surprising speed, color coming back into her face, the stiffness easing from her joints, though she remained, by her own admission, glad to let the burden of the coastal treaty's daily management fall to younger hands. She named Glasha formally not merely as her heir, but as the clan's appointed voice in all matters concerning the renewed pact, a role that meant regular travel between the Highland camp and the coast, travel that Glasha undertook, in the months that followed, with Thomas at her side more often than not. The village took longer to fully accept what had happened in their harbor that storm-racked night, as villages always do, but acceptance came steadily, helped along by the plain evidence of full nets and calm waters, and helped further by the sight of Glasha Thunderroar working alongside Thomas at his homestead in the weeks after the duel mending fences, hauling nets down at the docks when Garrick's hands ached too badly to manage alone, standing openly beside the huntsman at the village well, without either of them hiding what they had become to each other. Old Murren, for her part, took to telling the story of the wardens waking to any traveler who passed through Saltmere Cove, embellishing it a little more each time, until the tale of the huntsman and the chieftain's daughter had become something like local legend within a single season. Krogan Ashclaw, to his credit, did not remain bitter forever. It took the better part of a year, and more than one grudging conversation over shared hunting duties along the border between clan lands and village fields. But by the time the next full moon festival came around, a celebration Vashka, instituted specifically to mark the renewed pact, held each year on the anniversary of the warden's coming, even Krogan stood among the gathered crowd without visible resentment, raising a horn of dark mead in a toast alongside everyone else. That festival, held on the cliff above Saltmere Cove, where the whole harbor could be seen glittering under torchlight and a fat silver moon, was where Thomas Chandler and Glasha Thunderroar finally stood together before both their peoples, not as huntsman and scout, not as chieftain's heir and human suspect, but simply as themselves, hand in hand, in front of villagers who had learned to call her friend and warriors who had learned to call him kin. Vashka spoke the old words of binding that her own grandmother had once spoken over Ugra Thunderroar and Elias Chandler by that same water. 4 generations past, words of shared harvest and shared protection, of 2 bloodlines woven together not merely by old debt, but now by chosen love freely given. Glasha wore, for the occasion, the same fitted leather armor she had worn the very first night Thomas found her crouched on his fence rail, dark and supple and unmistakably her, though now a fine cord of braided bone beads, a gift from her mother, marking her formally as bridge between two peoples, hung at her throat, beside the faded mark of the claiming bite Thomas still bore with quiet pride. When Vashka finished speaking, she took Thomas's hand and Glasha's hand both in her own weathered grip and pressed them together, sealing the moment before the assembled crowd of villagers and warriors both. And the cheer that rose then, warm and unrestrained, with no trace of the fear or suspicion that had marked their first meeting on that same cliff rolled out across the calm, glittering harbor like a promise finally, fully kept. "No weakness worth attacking," Glasha murmured to him later that night, as they stood alone at last on the same cliff edge where she had first kissed him weeks before all of this began, watching torchlight from the festival still glowing warm behind them and the sea stretching dark and peaceful beyond. "That is what I told my mother, the first report I ever gave about you. And now?" Thomas asked, pulling her close against the evening chill, her strength and warmth entirely familiar to him now, entirely his to lean into. "Now," Glasha said, resting her head against his shoulder with a contentment that still, some nights, surprised her with how completely she had come to feel it, "I would say the same thing, but for an entirely different reason. There is no weakness in you worth attacking, Thomas Chandler. There never was. Only a strength I did not expect to find, and a heart I did not expect to lose to a man I was sent to judge unworthy." "Lucky for both of us," Thomas said, "that you have never been very good at following orders you disagreed with." Glasha laughed, low and warm, the sound of it settling into him the way it always did, like coming home to a fire that never quite went out, and together they stood at the edge of the cliff above Saltmere Cove, the harbor calm and glittering below them, the old debt paid at last not in blood alone but in a love neither of them had gone looking for and neither of them now could imagine living without.